Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Curtis, Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program here at CNAS. Welcome to the next panel of our annual conference, Beyond Hub and Spoke, a new Indo-Pacific order. I'm speaking to you today from Jakarta, Indonesia, which I think is appropriate given the topic of our discussion. On this panel, we will discuss how the United States can shore up its alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region to enhance deterrence, prevent conflict, and maintain free and open seaways. The United States is in the process of creating overlapping networks of partnerships, alliances, and multilateral groupings with the ultimate goal of creating a stable regional order. There has been remarkable progress in the last 18 months in advancing the work of the Quad, made up of the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. President Biden also recently hosted the leaders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, demonstrating the priority the White House places on this community of nations focused on economic development and promoting peace in the region. The other major initiative reshaping the Indo-Pacific order is the AUKUS agreement between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. To open our discussion today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Deputy Assistant to the President and White House Indo-Pacific Coordinator, Dr. Kurt Campbell. Dr. Campbell was appointed to his current position on the first day of the Biden administration. He previously served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs in the Obama administration, and also as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Director at the NSC earlier in his career. He was also Chairman and CEO of the Asia Group, which he founded in 2013. His most important job, of course, was co-founding with Michelle Flournoy, CNAS, in January 2007. We are excited to be celebrating our 15th anniversary. So, without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Dap Campbell.
Lisa, thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. And I have to say, just tremendous gratitude to you and Richard. What a terrific job that you've done with the Center for New American Security. I can remember 15 years ago when we were doing our first conference, we could never have imagined what you all have built in the subsequent years. I am in awe, I'm in enormous gratitude, and appreciate the leading work that the CNAS and its team has done on so many issues, including your work and your team's work on the Indo-Pacific. I know our time is limited today, and we're joined by terrific folks, Ambassador Sinodinos, our colleagues from the East-West Center. I want to do a particular shout out to Congressman Bera, who has been extraordinarily engaged on the effort to stand up and step up our game in the Indo-Pacific. So Lisa, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about where we've been, but as importantly, where we want to go. And I think that might be a subject of conversation as we go forward. I think all of you who follow the Indo-Pacific know a little bit, at least enough, about what our theory of the case has been. At the outset, the determination was to focus initially on some domestic investments. And you think, well, what does that have to do with the Indo-Pacific? I think the recognition being that the dominant areas of competition for the 21st century would be in cutting-edge, high-end areas of technology like 5G, semiconductors, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, human sciences. And I think there has been a determined effort to work in a bipartisan manner on making the right kinds of investments domestically, and also to learn the lessons of previous experiences of investments to try to supercharge technology pursuits domestically, the public-private partnerships per se. I think the next phase has been working closely with partners and allies. And Lisa, I can stand here today and tell you after 16, 18 months that we are gratified at the level of engagement that we've seen both with bilateral partners, a strengthening of initiatives with Japan and South Korea and Australia, really unprecedented levels of engagement, not only on the traditional issues of alliance building, but also on cutting edge 21st areas of importance like climate change. Look at our partnership with South Korea, 5 or 10 years ago, much of the investment in technology was moving to China. That has changed fundamentally. Much of it has moved now on advanced batteries and semiconductors to the United States, bringing jobs and investment to our shores. So grateful for those sets of initiatives. I will say the difference between this effort and previous efforts at rebalancing or pivoting, I think in the past, unfortunately, there was a sense in many respects that we were somehow pivoting away from other responsibilities. I think the highlight of this period has been the partnership that's been demonstrated with Europe in particular. I just returned from discussions with our colleagues in Germany. Those engagements on the Indo-Pacific are fundamentally different from just 10 years ago. The sense of common purpose, the desire to work more closely together, both on assessments of the region, also on investment protocols and how to strengthen supply chains is indeed impressive. So across the board, bilateral engagements. I would also add to that, Lisa, what I would call institutional innovations. You mentioned AUKUS. I would simply say watch this space. I think we've made behind the scenes quietly remarkable progress in areas associated with technology where not only the three countries are deeply engaged, but other partners are also supporting working groups. And we will have more to say shortly with regard to the submarine initiative. And I just want to underscore that as we see a new government coming, finding its legs in Australia, the partnership on AUKUS could not be stronger. We're very gratified by the engagement on these and many other issues that we've had with the new Albanese government, with the strong support of Penny Wong and the Defense Minister Marles. So I would simply say that in initiatives like AUKUS, like the Quad, and Lisa was involved in previous periods of engagement in the Quad, I think what we've tried to do is take this to the leader level, to recognize that the Quad initiative, foreign ministry engagement is critically important, but now at the leader level, we're able to drive larger initiatives like vaccine initiative, more recently what we're attempting to do on maritime domain awareness, and we have other ambitions to follow on issues associated with green shipping and infrastructure engagement as a whole. The first class of scholars that will be coming to the United States for the Quad education initiative is now gathering. So we're very excited about this. I will say in 14, 16, 18 short months, the habits of cooperation, the engagements, the cultural building of the habits of working together are taking root. And I've seen it myself. It's exciting. It's gratifying to see four strong maritime democracies working together is essential. I know that there was some concern about whether the United States would have a strong and determined economic trade pillar to our overall engagement. And we believe that the initiative launched by the President and Prime Minister Kishida with IPEF begins that important process. Key countries from Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, all obviously key countries across ASEAN, but as importantly, new entrants into this engagement, India, and for the first time ever, Fiji, Pacific Island nation that is committed to work through key 21st century issues like supply chains, clean energy, issues associated with electronic trade and the like. We have no doubts that this is going to be challenging and difficult. It will test us as all trade negotiations do, but we are committed to involve ourselves deeply in this process, and we are ambitious about what can be accomplished. I will say, Lisa, and I'll just close with this and open it up to the panel as we go forward. We have many things that we're working to do going forward. I think we want to make sure that we're engaging appropriately in diplomacy with Chinese interlocutors. The National Security Advisor met with Yang Jiechi just 2 days ago in Luxembourg. I was with him. We had a detailed and very frank set of discussions about Ukraine, about North Korea, about Southeast Asia, about the Indo-Pacific strategy, keeping those lines of communication open, trying to remove areas of potential miscalculation, trying to make sure that there are communication links in the case of inadvertence or miscalculation. That is the primary pursuit as we try to build what is undeniably a competitive relationship, but hopefully a peaceful relationship in which the best aspects of competition on both sides can be brought out. One of the things that we're going to want to do in the next little while is to step up our game substantially in the Pacific. This is an area of enormous strategic importance. We have historical and moral responsibilities, both from the Second World War and subsequent, the nuclear age. We are stepping up across the board in the ways bilaterally, whether it's the fishing treaties, whether it's our COFA negotiations, maritime domain awareness, unexploded ordnance, climate change, illegal fishing, all the things that matter in the Pacific. We are trying to meet the Pacific where they live. And I'm gratified to say not only are we doing this on a bilateral basis, but we will be launching next week an initiative to work with a variety of like-minded countries on an open, very detailed set of engagements in which we share our views, work closely with partners in the Pacific Island Forum to ensure that like-minded countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the United States, Great Britain, France, and others are able to make clear our desire to keep a Pacific environment that's open, that's healthy, that's productive, and free from coercion. So we have our work cut out for us, Lisa. I think we're pleased by some of the things, but we have a number of issues that require urgent and immediate attention. There is no time ever to rest on laurels. It's critical that as we go forward, that the foundational matters on which we engage, we do in a bipartisan manner and also do it in close consultations with allies and partners. Again, thank you for having me at CNAS. It's thrilling to see you guys do what you do, and it's just a privilege that you invited me back. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kurt Campbell, for that remarkable statement, not only explaining the vision, but also all the activities and actions that the Biden administration is taking, and an amazing tempo of diplomacy in the region, I might add. So we're now going to turn to the audience for some questions. We have just a few minutes for questions. So I would like to ask the audience to use the chat function and make sure you identify yourself when you ask your question. But I'd like to take the privilege of being the moderator to ask the first question. So there has been some criticism that the funding or the budgets allocated to the Indo-Pacific region don't always match the rhetoric of, the region being the priority, of competition with China being the major priority. So is that a valid criticism in your opinion? And if so, where should the administration start to make a shift when it comes to funding for the region?
Lisa, in fact, I do think it's a valid criticism. I think in the past, when we've attempted to step up our game, the first thing people ask are, where are the resources? And is there the appropriate high-level attention on the critical issues playing out in the Indo-Pacific? I think because we've been to this rodeo before, we understand how things can be diverted. There is much more focus this time on building key capacities on the defense side, in AID budgets, spread throughout the various parts of the Interior Department and elsewhere, to ensure that we are, in fact, backing up our rhetoric with specific programs. And I think over time, you will see this manifest in a number of ways. So what we primarily focus on, and the easiest one to sort of recognize, is on the defense side. And Lisa, I think you know that, and you probably see the upcoming budgets do have some critical investments in short-term and longer-term demands in the Indo-Pacific. I don't know if we get into all of those things, but what you will also see is specific initiatives to build more embassies where we don't have any in the Pacific, really. We'll try to step up our game, more Coast Guard initiatives, more money for things like the tuna treaty, more money so you can go down the list, more money for education in Southeast Asia. So the hope will be, as you basically sum this up over time and you're persistent and engaged in making the arguments, that you are clearly underscoring that this is not simply a rhetorical or a policy-driven initiative, that there are also programmatic details to follow. I will say, just in conclusion here, yes, it's appropriate and necessary to find new money. But over time, one of the hardest things in government is to make choices among existing, priorities and regions. And that's very difficult. And I think what we are experiencing right now, Lisa, is dramatic demand for American leadership in engagement, not just in the Indo-Pacific. And in fact, the demand signal has been deeply reassuring on some level. The countries want the United States to deeply engage. And we saw that during the ASEAN summit that you so graciously raised. But the demand signal in the Middle East and Europe is also very strong during the period of critical challenges. So how we meet those challenges at a time of economic, uncertainty is real. And so you have to make a powerful argument not only for new resources, but we'll have to make the argument that going forward, the lion's share of the history is going to be playing out in the Indo-Pacific, and we have to really take the necessary budgetary steps to reflect that in our activities.
Great, thank you. We do have a question from the audience from C. Yang, a reporter from Voice of America. He asked, how do you see the rearmaments of both Germany and Japan? How is it going to affect the world order?
Well, so personally, I again, just coming back from Germany, I've been extremely impressed at the responsible way the new German government has engaged on the tragedy of Ukraine. Deep dialogue, fundamental engagement with transatlantic partners, close partnership with the United States, and a transparent, responsible set of ambitions around increasing defense spending. Now, that's true, it's come quickly, but the truth is the reality on the ground in Europe, the demands required of strong democratic states like Germany to do more are clear. And so I think, that is entirely appropriate. And I think Germany is a deeply responsible nation. And the memories of a distant period, I do not think animate the modern concerns of Europe. And I would say the same of Japan. Japan has been deeply committed to peace and stability in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. They have carefully become more engaged in the defense and security pursuits and responsibly engaged in the Indo-Pacific. The United States has complete confidence in Japan making the right decisions about playing a more active role across the board. But what we are seeing is not just Japan, Lisa, stepping up on defense, but Japan stepping up on everything, a stronger role on climate diplomacy, a stronger role in Southeast Asia. When we indicated we wanted to work more with like-minded nations in the Pacific, Japan was there to stand up. So what we are seeing is a more active, responsible, leading set of attributes in the current Japanese leadership in Prime Minister Kishida and his team that we are both deeply grateful for and admiring of.
Okay, I have just one more question. I have to take it. This is from a dear friend and colleague, my partner in crime in the previous administration, Alice Wells, of course, former Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia. Alice asked, does it matter that Quad partners have different policy responses to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
So look, I think it is unrealistic to expect that on every issue that you'll have complete alignment among four diverse, dynamic nations. I think it is clear, however, in conversations and engagements with Indian friends, they understand the gravity of the situation playing out in Ukraine. They also have a long-standing relationship with Russia, and Russia has been the key provider of military equipment to India for decades. And so I think what we have tried to do in a responsible way is to privately engage Indian colleagues in an effort to communicate quite clearly that over time we want to build a stronger relationship with India. And that means doing a number of things, if I may say. One, we need to help provide India with alternatives on the security side. That means not only the United States providing capabilities, but partners like Great Britain, France, and Israel. We are working with other countries to support India so it has a broader set of choices when it comes to security and defense. We need to make clear institutionally that we're going to step up our partnerships across the Indian government, stronger intelligence links, stronger trade and economic links. That will be difficult, but necessary, and obviously political links with closer ties, not just at the presidential prime minister leader, but institutions like the 2+2. We had, at least as you know, an outstanding 2+2 that was deeply meaty, able to talk about a range of issues where we are determined to increase our cooperation and engagement. I think the longer term trajectory will bring the United States and India much closer together. I think there are always challenges in our bilateral relationship. The key is to remain purposeful, to understand that the most important relationship, in my view, for the United States in the 21st century is likely to be with India. And it's critical that we take the necessary steps to signal how important India is to the United States.
Well, thank you. That was a very clear answer, and thank you for your remarks. We have to move on to the panel discussion now, but really appreciated you giving us such insight into the future of the Indo-Pacific order.
Thank you, Lisa, and enjoy your time down there in Indonesia.
Thank you. I am. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce the members of our distinguished panel. First, we have Representative Mike McCaul. Congressman McCaul is currently serving his 9th term representing Texas' 10th District in the United States Congress. The 10th Congressional District of Texas stretches from the city of Austin to the Houston suburbs. At the start of the 116th Congress, Congressman McCaul became the Republican leader of the Foreign Affairs Committee. In his capacity as the committee's Republican leader, he is committed to ensuring we promote America's leadership on the global stage. Welcome, Congressman McCaul. Next, we will have Representative Ami Bera. Congressman Ami Bera has represented California's 7th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2013. The 7th District is located just east of California's capital city, Sacramento. Representative Bera is currently a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation. He is a first-generation American-born and raised in California and had a 20-year career in medicine before entering Congress. Welcome to you, Congressman Bera. Next, we have Ambassador Sinodinos. He is Australia's ambassador to the United States since February 2020. He was previously Australia's Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, and he was Senator for New South Wales in the Australian Parliament from 2011 to 2019. He also served as former Prime Minister John Howard's Senior Economic Advisor. And in 2008, Ambassador Sinodinos was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia. And welcome to you, sir. Last but certainly not least, we have General Suzanne Vares-Lum. General Vares-Lum has been president of the East-West Center since January 2022. She is the first woman and Native Hawaiian to be chosen for this role. She brings decades of executive leadership and planning experience and served for 5 years as an advisor at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. As a retired Major General with 34 years of service, General Vares-Lum has held key roles addressing priority national security challenges in the region. She received the Ellis Island Medal of Honor in 2017. In addition, the State of Hawaii House of Representatives, Governor of the State of Hawaii, and Hawaii Congressional Delegation presented her with certificates of recognition for outstanding service to the State of Hawaii in 2021. So welcome, General Vares-Lum. So we will start with you, Representative McCaul. What role do you think the U.S. Congress has in helping to shape the environment of the Indo-Pacific so that the rules-based order that has defined the region since World War II is sustained? How important is it for Congress to pass legislation that will underpin U.S. commitment to this vital region?
I think it's very vital, very important. Congress has a very strong role to play, and we have. To your point, it's my father's war. He's in World War II, and it kind of shaped both the Pacific and Europe after World War II. And we have new opportunities, but new threats in the Indo-Pacific. I think we need to strengthen our economic ties, particularly with the ASEAN alliance, but also our trade alliances. And that's how we can become closer to these countries as we compete with China. Obviously, China is getting more and more aggressive in the region. We passed the Taiwan Assurances Act towards normalization of our relationship following the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. You saw recently with the visit with Secretary Austin and basically the Secretary of Defense in the PRC had a very heated exchange about Taiwan and the possibility of going to war. We know that they're very set on the South China Sea. They have artificial islands. So there is that great competition, I think, between China and the United States and its allies like Japan and like Australia. And that's where the Quad comes into play with India as well. Very important. This will be the largest sort of economic region, if you will, moving forward. This is where a lot of the market share for the world is going to exist. And the United States needs to be a player. We need to be there. And too often, whether it's Indo-Pacific or Africa or Latin America, we're not on the field. And if you're not on the field, you can't win the competition. So we need to play a bigger role. I would also, one of your previous questions to the former member was the funding issue. I mean, we only put 7% of our budget towards the Indo-Pacific, while the Pentagon is putting a majority of their budget. The Pentagon puts a lot of emphasis on the Indo-Pacific because they know this is probably where the biggest threat is, in addition to the alliance that President Xi has with Mr. Putin now, that sort of unholy alliance that we saw come out. So I think we need to be more aggressive in the region. It is the place where the biggest opportunities for business will be moving forward, and we need to be on the field. And I think the federal government needs to step it up as well. And Congress will obviously play a huge role, in addition to the Foreign Affairs Committee, that is, we've been very focused on this part of the world, and will continue to do so.
Great, thank you so much. Very, very interesting. Next, I'd like to turn to you, Representative Bera. While there have been many discussions about shifting security and defense focus to this vital region, as we just heard, there has been less attention in Congress to the issue of State Department and USAID prioritizing the Indo-Pacific region in their budgets. Which specific areas should U.S. diplomats and aid workers be focusing their attention to support this vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific? What can they do to strengthen the regional architecture and knit together the work of the Quad, ASEAN, and other multilateral groupings to strengthen the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific?
Lisa, thanks for that question. I could say, let me just agree with everything that Kurt outlined in the first portion of this section, but the importance of funding our diplomatic development, our soft power skills is hugely important. We had a full committee hearing earlier this week where we talked about that with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Peace Corps, the Development Finance Corporation, all incredibly important as we compete for influence in that region. There's huge returns on small programs where we work with local newspapers to make sure our story is getting out there, because we know that that Beijing is putting out a very different story. And in the competition for influence, small investments in diplomacy and development can yield huge returns. Dr. Campbell touched a little bit on what we see in the Pacific Islands right now, and having embassies in many of these islands, again, a small investment can have huge returns. Having ambassadors to these islands, hugely important. Making sure that we're working with local media to get our story out. Again, doesn't cost a lot, but huge returns on investment. We saw that in the Cold War in Europe, and certainly I think we can do that here because we have a better story to tell than does Beijing. And that's evident. We're not asking the countries in the region to choose the United States or China. We're asking them, if we're not telling our story, if we're not present, then our story is not getting out. I think that's why it's super important. Dr. Campbell touched on another important area, that we shouldn't do this alone. We can be very proud of what we did as a country in the 75 years post-World War II. But what we also accomplished is, Japan being a leading nation, Korea being a leading nation, a Europe that is a leading nation. We should be doing this and, sending our values and economic opportunities to the region in partnership with our like-minded allies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. So there's huge opportunities here. And India is never easy, but as the senior Indian American member of Congress, India is vitally important. And it is great to see the Biden administration elevate the Quad to the leaders level. There'll always be bumps in the road with our relationship with India, but at the end of the day, India's interests align with our interests. So I think there's huge opportunities for all of us to work together to create a peaceful, prosperous Indo-Pacific region in the 21st century.
Great, thank you, thank you. Next, I'd like to go to Ambassador Sinodinos. Ambassador, can you provide us with the Australian perspective on the emerging Indo-Pacific order that we've heard so much about? How important is AUKUS in shaping this new order? What has been the regional reaction to AUKUS? And how do the visions for ASEAN, the Quad, and AUKUS fit together? And where might there be tensions between these organizations?
Well, thanks very much, Lisa. It's great to be with such a distinguished panel, but particular thank you to Dr. Campbell, because he's been the glue that's held a lot of these initiatives on the Indo-Pacific together in the last 12 to 18 months, and he's done a terrific job on that. I mean, Australia's perspective on this is very clear. Over the last few years, the sort of trends we were seeing in the region started to accelerate. So from Australia's perspective, we knew we had to do more in the region to respond to that. Part of that response was AUKUS. This was not an initiative where someone rang us up and said, look, you should do this. This was an Australian initiative to engage the US and the UK. And it was based on the philosophy behind our Defence Strategic Update in 2020, which talked about us having to have a role in deterring, shaping and responding what's going on in the region. And AUKUS is part of that. It's not a new alliance. It's a capability pact. It builds on existing traditional relationships and alliances. We see it as something which means we can be a better, more effective alliance partner in the region. It complements the other initiatives that we're taking in the region. We're part of the Quad because we believe that along with like-minded countries in the region, we should contribute to a positive vision of the region being free, open and inclusive. And it's not a coercive or expansionist sort of vision. It's really a vision of how do we make countries in the region feel more secure in themselves, more secure in their own independence, their capacity to exercise their sovereignty. We see AUKUS and the Quad actually supporting the sort of global rules-based order which has underwritten peace and prosperity since World War II. I think it's one of the greatest acts of enlightened self-interest by the US that after the war it embraced enemies like Japan and Germany along with allies in this new order. And this rules-based order is the thing that we seek to preserve and promote. There are some people who think that's an old-fashioned concept. They think with the rise of other powers that, it's old-fashioned to think in those terms. I don't think it is, because for countries large and small, being part of a rules-based order where there is some certainty about relations between countries is very important. We've seen that certainty shattered by what's happened in Ukraine. A big country deciding to invade a small, independent country, which has all it was doing was exercising its own sovereignty. Countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, have taken note of that. That's why you've seen such strong support for sanctions and whatever against Russia by countries as diverse as Japan, Singapore, for example. Countries in our region see the stakes at play in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And what we're seeking to do by our actions in supporting sanctions and whatever in that region, in Europe, is to indicate that in our own part of the world, we will stand up for the rules-based order, and that by the weight of GDP in countries doing that, we persuade other countries that they're better off trying to be constructive members of that order rather than seeking to upturn that order in their own image. For us as well, we often talk about the centrality of ASEAN. The Quad, AUKUS, all these other institutional mechanisms or whatever are not meant to in some way supplant the regional architecture. They complement the regional architecture. They work with each other. If you look at what the Quad is now doing, for example, the newest initiative around maritime domain awareness, that's an initiative which will encompass countries in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific, working together on maritime security issues, which go to matters like protecting exclusive economic zones, illegal fishing, being appropriately monitored and regulated, and the like. So for us, ASEAN remains central to the architecture of the region, but is complemented by these other institutional developments. And I just want to touch briefly on the Pacific. Kurt mentioned more to do in this space, and he's right. We do have more to do in that space. But again, we approach that area in a way that seeks to bolster the independence and the sovereignty of countries in the region. And to go back to Amy Bera's point before, we're not asking countries, whether in Southeast Asia or the Pacific, to choose one side over the other. That's not what this is about. But we are giving them a capacity to exercise more choice, and we're doing it within the context of our values as like-minded democracies.
Great, thank you. It is so great to get Australia's perspective. Very, very important. Next, I'd like to turn to General Vares-Lum and ask you, how do you see that countries in the region are viewing the United States role? Where do you see receptivity to the U.S. vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific? And where do you see resistance? And how might we overcome some of this resistance? What are the key messages and types of engagement that would build support for this vision of a rules-based order?
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for your leadership and highlighting these important issues. And aloha to everyone from the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, here in the center of the Pacific. And, as a daughter of this region, I would like to just thank all of our distinguished panelists for your insightful remarks and for your support of the East-West Center activities. You know, Lisa, while I can't speak for all the countries, I can say that in my interactions with various leaders in the Indo-Pacific, that there is certainly a high demand signal for U.S. engagement, presence, and economic partnership, as was mentioned by our panelists, you know, throughout the region. There's a desire really to create deeper alliances and partnerships, you know, that address the new and longstanding challenges as well as traditional and non-traditional areas. So I think we can see the most receptivity to the free and open Indo-Pacific, not just in our values, but in economic interests. You know, values alone, we have been pushing that a lot, but when it comes down to are the interests in mind as well, rather than just the rhetoric. And we see this desire through the response, like the very quick response in developing the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that's attracted 14 members, but you know, it's developing. And I think though, people are hungry for opportunities. You know, we see the cooperation from Fiji to India and many of the Southeast Asian countries, as well as other long-standing commercial partners. Where I see resistance with the U.S. relationships is when those relationships are perceived as transactional security relationships versus a whole of society approach to the relationship. You know, I think we need to work towards overcoming that resistance by coming to a place of understanding not only the regional organizations, but also the distinctiveness of each country, the political systems, history, culture, and their unique challenges. For example, in the Pacific, as an example, you know, there are common challenges that we heard everyone mention here that the Pacific Islands nations face. And, you know, therefore we tend to group the Pacific Island countries into one blue continent rather than seeing sometimes the diverse needs of the challenges of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, and how they're interrelated and how their histories are unique. So my sense is that, you know, regional leaders will seek a balanced approach to both security and commercial engagement, as well as consistent, and this was mentioned several times, consistent and persistent presence and engagement on multiple levels that reflect mutual interests, and I would add also cultural understanding and respect for people and place. Some of the, to me, the key messages, I know you had a lot of questions there, I'm not sure if I got them all, but really the key messages I think should center on the fact that the region has grown, has become strong because of the rules-based international order. And it's important to increase that messaging and engagement, not only in government to government, but in robust civil society engagements where those tight bonds and relationships are made. You know, those relationships where you build, where you can make that 5-minute phone call that took 25 years. You know, the educational exchange, the, you know, and I'm not just mentioning Asia Matters to America series because of the East-West Center, but, you know, really those terms, when I recently went to the our Oceans Conference in Palau and met with Pacific Island leaders, we talked about the Pacific Matters for America. I went right after the rollout in the Capitol Hill Visitor Center. And, you know, it resonated with the Pacific Island leaders and it was repeated, but not just Pacific Islands Matters to America, but that the Pacific Islands matters. And with that constant presence, I think it gave a sense of hope that the rhetoric will be followed up with actual investments in what Congressman Bera said in terms of real investment in soft power. That's educational opportunities. Just to give you an example of the young Southeast Asian leaders who were here recently, we had 20 of them. There were 15,000 applicants to come into our educational programs. Those are really concrete evidence of the desire to engage with the United States and the opportunities that are presented. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And certainly it's okay to tout the great work of the East-West Center for sure. So we seem to have lost Congressman McCaul, but they're seeking to bring him back in. I hope he's able to rejoin us soon. But in the meanwhile, let's continue with the questions. And I'll turn to you, Representative Bera. You mentioned India. And of course, this morning, our CNAS CEO, Richard Fontaine, had a conversation with National Security Advisor Sullivan. And in that discussion, they talked about India and its position toward Russia. And of course, the National Security Advisor acknowledged that there were differences between India and the U.S. over Russia, but that he evinced hope that over time, India might have a change in perspective. He was clear the U.S. would not lecture India, and that the U.S.-India dialogue, I think he said, was deep, respectful, and strategic. But I wondered if you could give us your thoughts on how might we incentivize India to shift its position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, let me start with echoing what the National Security Advisor said. Our relationship with India is deep, strategic, and is for the long haul here. So I think Kurt Campbell, talked about, we've certainly voiced our concerns about India continuing to buy oil and energy and indirectly supporting Russia in this horrific invasion of Ukraine. That said, we also understand the historic relationship between India and Russia. It also creates opportunities for us. I think Kurt touched on something that we're working on in foreign military assistance, perhaps working closely with Israel, with countries like Korea and others, to, as India has a harder time servicing its defense equipment. I think the Indians have also shown an appetite to move towards the West and towards the United States. So I think there's an opportunity there. And that's something we in Congress are actively working on in concert with the administration. The long-term trajectory, though, for India from a strategic perspective is, they're concerned about China. You see the aggression on the northern border. India sees that. You see China, in Djibouti. You see China trying to, get a foothold in Tanzania and other places. With an eye to the Indian Ocean, I think China understands its strategic competition with India. And India understands that its competitor is China. And at the end of the day, the alignment with the Quad, with Australia, the United States, Japan, really does, their interests align with our interests. And at the end of the day, if there is a competition or confrontation between China and India, we've been very clear that they shouldn't expect that Russia is going to side with India. Russia has already picked sides in any potential future competition. I also think it's incredibly important that India has engaged with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Let's keep moving that along. An elusive bilateral trade deal has always been one day away or 1 month away. I think IPEF gives us the opportunity to do something that's good for the region, but also good for India. We wait to see, as the president travels to the Middle East, we've seen this I2, U2, announcement of Israel, India, the United States, and the UAE. We'll wait to, I haven't gotten a readout on, the contours of what that looks like, but I've spent my 10 years in Congress working on a trilateral Israel, India, United States relationship with leading democracies in our parts of the world. There's a lot of synergy that happens there. And so I'm optimistic. There's always hiccups in the road in our relationship with India, but at the end of the day, the trajectory is always moving in the right direction. So both in economics, both in the defense to defense space, and I think the Ambassador Sinodinos can talk to this more specifically, but the Indian-Australian relationship I think is strong, and clearly Korea and Japan and others see the importance of India in the region.
Great, thank you. And yeah, as a longtime follower of the U.S.-India relationship, I agree with you. There have been ups and downs, but the long-term trajectory is positive and headed in the right direction. And I'm so glad you mentioned India's membership of IPEF. I think that's really important and is a real demonstration of Indian interest in working with the United States and others in the region. Ambassador Sinodinos, you did mention the Pacific in your earlier remarks, but I'd like to delve a little bit deeper. Of course, during the recent Australian elections, the Chinese security agreement with the Solomon Islands became a major campaign issue. How can Australia and the United States engage more closely with the Pacific Islands and better incorporate them into this new Indo-Pacific order that we're talking about?
Thanks, Lisa. I want to pick up on a point that Suzanne made before, which was very important, which was about the respect with which you engage the countries in the region. In this case, the Pacific Island countries. They have a very strong sense of themselves as a family. Australia and New Zealand are part of the Pacific Islands Forum. We're part of the family. And in that part of the world, first of all, they don't like the idea of being caught in the middle of some geostrategic competition, right? They're very focused on their own issues. They're very focused on their development. They're very focused on education, on health. They've been very hard hit by COVID. They've had to sort of seal themselves off. They've taken big hits to their tourism, which is often the main income earner. And of course, fisheries have been an ongoing issue. I think the best way to engage them always is to really be, first of all, listening to them. We can go to them with initiatives, and countries, as Kurt mentioned, will go to them with initiatives, and we'll go as a bit of a grouping just to make the point that we're being very supportive. But I think the important thing is that this is organic and evolving, and that we listen to them and cater to developments as they see them. And make sure that regional institutions like the Pacific Islands Forum are as strong as possible. So I guess my remarks are really more about the process by which we go about this and the governance around that rather than specific initiatives. Kurt mentioned some of the specific initiatives that are possible. But our view is that you best sell the sort of global order we're talking about by showing what in action it means about how you relate to other countries and how you deal with them, and draw the contrast with some of the other powers which have sought to do stuff in the region.
Great. Thank you. I'm sorry we lost Congressman Bera. He had to leave for a flight, which is very understandable. He's going back to his constituents in California. But let's continue. I do have another question for you, General Vares-Lum, and that's that you have spent your career in the military, right? But now you're leading an organization that is focused on building people-to-people ties and cultural understanding. So I wondered if you could talk about these two different perspectives and how the emerging regional architecture that we're talking about will be shaped by both defense and non-defense initiatives, and how should the U.S. balance its security imperatives with the region's desire for other kinds of engagement?
Thanks, Lisa, for that question. I get asked that a lot. I think the difference lies, of course, in engaging in the region in traditional security as versus non-traditional people-to-people relations, as you mentioned. Having spent 5 and actually a half years at Indo-Pacific Command until mid last year, I worked in the region on military-to-military, bilateral, multilateral dialogues, and most of these were centered on security issues. And of course, we tried to work in areas of common interest, disaster response, IUU, illegal trafficking, terrorism, all those activities that demonstrated our ability to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, focused on the national security challenges through building partner capacity with our allies and partners, that include Australia, of course, very much, engagements, exercises. But coming here since January, you see that the East-West Center investments are in people, in the soft power that Congressman Bera talked about. The mission since 1960, when President Eisenhower signed into law the East-West Center, because they realized coming out of the ashes of World War II and into a Cold War, that you needed more dialogue. And I've heard that through everyone. An ambassador knows that well. Dialogue is key. and respect is key. So the mission of the East-West Center since 1960 is to promote that understanding among people and nations of the United States, Asia, and the Pacific through the soft power approaches, cooperative study, research, dialogue. And that cooperative study really is investing in emerging leaders and also established leaders and bringing them together in a variety of forums and through education. You know, as I mentioned, when I went to our oceans, I got to engage with a lot of high-level leaders and some heads of state. You know, the Prime Minister of Tonga is a East-West Center alum, and he mentioned that his father was as well, and really is looking for educational opportunities. And that ask, even after the devastating impact of the what happened with the volcanic eruption and subsequent tsunami in Tonga, we saw how you know, the community and resilience. So not only COVID, but this natural disaster and the economic downturn, there's a lot of needs there, but definitely reaching out to all the partners in the region, but asking for educational opportunities because they're thinking generationally. You know, so it's important, as we heard, to invest in that diplomacy, invest in the economic development information, but it really comes through investing in the leaders who are going to make those decisions today and tomorrow. And I think, you know, the region really wants to be assured that the United States and our partners and our allies care about sustainable economic investments, not just a one-way investment.
Thank you. I think I have just one more question, and then I'd like to turn to the audience Q&A. So again, if you have a question, please use the chat function and identify yourself when you pose your question. But I'll pose this to both of you. In this morning's discussion with National Security Advisor Sullivan, he told Richard Fontaine that the president would unveil a partnership for infrastructure at the G7 meeting in Madrid next week. So, you know, I'm here in Indonesia, and I have heard all week about the absence of U.S. investment when it comes to infrastructure in particular. Countries like Indonesia and others don't really want to have to rely solely on China for such investment. But at the same time, the U.S. needs to make a deliberative effort to show up in the region and be an active economic player. And of course, IPEF is aimed at this. But I wondered if either of you had any thoughts on the specific issue of infrastructure and what you've heard from the region, what the needs are, and how the U.S. and its partners should be working together to meet these needs. Ambassador Sinodinos.
I'm happy to kick off on that one. Look, there's no doubt there's, as in many parts of the world these days, a bit of an infrastructure gap that has to be met. And if you look at a country like Indonesia, it has particular needs that you'll be well aware of being on the ground there at the moment. They've set up a sovereign wealth fund to help with that process. Countries like Australia are doing what we can to assist. We've encouraged the US to be involved as well on the infrastructure side. I think for the president of Indonesia, his priority for the remaining time in his term is to further supercharge infrastructure development in Indonesia. He's also looking at issues like building the new capital in due course because Jakarta is sinking. And so there are some very important needs, but it's also a big opportunity for the US. We encouraged President Biden to meet with President Jokowi, obviously in the context not just of the US ASEAN summit, but previous to that as well. We've encouraged US officials to do deep dives on Indonesia to more clearly identify priorities for investment and partnership with us in that area. We think paying appropriate due to Indonesia because of its size and role and significance in the region is very important. As we see this as an important priority for the US going forward, we're putting more funds not just into Southeast Asia, but into Indonesia specifically, including around climate initiatives. So for us, and particularly under the new Australian government, that's become an important priority. So to borrow a phrase from someone else on this webinar earlier, watch this space.
Great, thank you. Do you have anything to add, General Vares-Lum?
Lisa, I do want to just highlight what the ambassador said. I think sustainable infrastructure investment is critical and key, and that's been the ask of many countries in the region. But I think, collaborating together to see where we can bring garner all of our strengths so that you don't have a piecemeal approach to infrastructure, in many of these countries that are asking for it. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've lost you, General Vares-Lum. You've frozen up.
Did you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you now, yes.
Oh, okay, I apologize. I was just, foot stomping what the ambassador said, is that, there are requests, of course, a demand signal for sustainable infrastructure development, but as many countries have said, and I've heard them say, is that we are going to go where sometimes we don't have a choice, right? So if we allowed to give them a choice by collaborating and bringing together all of our efforts, pooling our resources so that we are not piecemealing the approach for infrastructure in some of these developing countries, I think would be a great approach. I hope you were able to hear me. Sorry, Lisa.
Yes, I heard you perfectly fine, and I apologize. I think it may be me who is fading, not you. So let's see if we have time for one more question. Let's see, we're getting a lot on China and North Korea. So let me just ask if any of you have anything to add to this question from a reporter from Radio Free Asia, Sangman L. Do you think China will be cooperative with the U.S. when it comes to dealing with North Korea nuclear issue, nuclear and missile program issue? Would either one of you like to address this issue of North Korea, which of course is in the headlines so much in the last few weeks?
Well, from what I'm aware, this is one of the areas the US has marked out for cooperation with China, as opposed to an area for competition or whatever else. And of course, Australia and other countries have a deep interest in monitoring what is happening in regards to North Korea. And certainly we encourage all the parties who have influence on the situation to exert that influence, to encourage North Korea, I think, to be more rational in its approach to these matters. We recognize these matters are of long standing, and there's been a point of leverage for the North Koreans to be able to have these missile programs. But really, in the long run, the best thing is to try and find a way to persuade North Korea that its interest actually lies in focusing on economic development of its people.
Great, thank you. Do you have anything to add, General Vares-Lum?
I would just say that it certainly is in China's interest to be cooperative, to deal with the impacts and the consequences of what might happen. So I think, just wanted to foot stomp what the ambassador said there as well.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but this has really been a wonderful panel. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And thank you, of course, Ambassador Sinodinos and General Vares-Lum. It was a pleasure to have you. And please stay tuned for our next panel. This will be on Russia-China relations, the Russia-China nexus. How should the United States compete? And that panel will start at 2:30. So this will be an important session looking at the evolving Russia-China relationship, and will assess how U.S. national security leaders should view this growing challenge. Thank you very much.